Hey, welcome back, PVA students, to our next lecture here in U.S. history for the Paulding Virtual Academy. Today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be discussing the causes and outcomes of World War I. So, World War I really takes place from about 1914 to 1919 is going to be the dates of World War I. But for the U.S., we're not involved for the entire thing. Now, just a little bit of background on the war. Now, there's a bunch of different reasons why the war in general gets started. You've got all the competing rivalries for empires that are happening among European countries as they scramble for Africa and for Asia. You also have the building up of powerful military systems. You've got an alliance system that kind of draws everybody together. For instance, you have the Triple Alliance of Austria-Hungary, Italy, and Germany. You have the Triple Entente of France, Great Britain, and Russia. And so all of these kind of interlocking things are all going to kind of help to cause the start of the war. Now, in addition to this, you've also got increased nationalism as well. This idea that your country was just better than everybody else's that were out there. And the place that a lot of this was really strong in was in a place called the Balkans, where Serbia was going to hope to unite with Austrian Slavs. And so this mountainous peninsula in the southeastern corner of Europe was home to an assortment of ethnic groups. They had a long history of nationalist uprisings and ethnic clashes. It was known as the powder keg of Europe. Now, look, by the early 1900s, the Ottoman Empire, which included the Balkan region, was in rapid decline. While some Balkan groups struggled to free themselves from the Ottoman Turks, which are in this region right over here, others had already succeeded in breaking away from their Turkish rulers. And they'd formed new nations, including Bulgaria, Greece, Montenegro, Romania, and Serbia. Now, that's that entire area right over there. But this area is going to be a ticking time bomb because in 1914, Serbian terrorists are going to assassinate the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. And this is going to go ahead and trigger the start of World War I. And it does so because Germany and Austria-Hungary are going to be joined by Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. And they're going to end up forming these Central Powers. Now, England, France, and Russia, they're going to become the Allied powers, and they're going to be eventually joined in by most of the countries around the world, including the United States, are going to form the Allied powers. And this is kind of just the rundown of the list. Now, when the war breaks out, though, this becomes a big test for the new U.S. foreign policy. All right, in 1914, we're just coming out of this era of imperialism. We see ourselves now as a world power. We now have overseas territories. We have influence in Latin America with places like the Panama Canal, which has just been completed. We've got the Roosevelt corollary going on in Asia with the open door policy. The thing is, though, with Europe, though, is that we still want to maintain our neutrality. This goes all the way back to the Roosevelt corollary, which said, hey, look, we're going to stay out, but we'll use our police powers in Latin America, to the Monroe Doctrine, said, hey, we're going to stay out. All right, but this half of the world is ours, all the way back to Washington's farewell address, which just said, hey, we're going to stay out of European affairs. But we are going to be drawn into the war, and you need to know a few of the specific reasons what brings us in to World War I. One of the first major reasons that brings us into the war is going to be the German violations of U.S. neutrality and free trade. One of the big ways that Germany was doing this was using what was called unrestricted submarine warfare and attacked passenger ships as well as cargo ships that were on the high seas. The most famous incident was the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania was a British ship. However, it carried Americans, and there was Americans on board. And the Lusitania wasn't the only example of this, though it was probably the most famous example of German submarines attacking shipping and American shipping and killing Americans on the high seas. Now, the Germans knew that this would likely bring us into the war, and so one of the final straws that brought us into the war was something that was called the Zimmerman telegram. And the actual telegram's there on the right-hand side. It's all the That's all in code. And what the Zimmerman telegram was is that on the eve of when the Germans figured we were probably going to enter the war, they had sent a message to Mexico saying that if the United States entered the war, that Mexico should attack the United States and reclaim the lost territories that they lost to us during the Mexican-American War. Now, trying to go ahead and work with our neighbor to attack us was in many ways outrageous. And it got published in places like the New York Times, and this absolutely outraged all of America. So even though we had remained neutral in this war from 1914 to 1917, we declare war on the Central Powers in April of 1917 as a result of Germany messing with our trade, the sinking of the Lusitania, and the Zimmerman telegram. And Wilson says that he's going to make the world safe for democracy. Now, U.S. soldiers arrive shortly thereafter in Europe, and we arrive really at a very crucial time. Now, we see our first fighting action in May of 1918 just outside Paris. We participate in a counterattack against Germany. And throughout this entire thing, the American Expeditionary Force, which was the name of U.S. soldiers in Europe during World War I, is going to help to start to turn the tide of the war against the Germans. Now, by the end of the year of 1918, many of the other Central Powers are going to start to surrender. And on November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the King of Germany, abdicates his throne. He steps down. And then, shortly thereafter, only 2 days later, on November 11th, 1918, Germany is going to sign an armistice, which is basically a ceasefire that's going to bring World War I to an end. Now, the United States and U.S. soldiers are going to reluctantly enter World War I. And we really, for the most part, only play a supportive role in the fighting. But it's going to change America in many ways. Huge number of casualties, all right? And the world is transformed. There's 22 million people dead, 20 million people wounded. There's 10 million refugees. But the next really big thing for you to know is what happens after the war. And when it ends, our president, Woodrow Wilson, believes that the United States needs to take this leading role in trying to shape the peace process. And his idea for the peace treaty that should be the end of the war, he's going to call the 14 points. And what he wants to do is he wants to get rid of the different things that caused World War I in the first place, things like militarism and imperialism. And he hopes to avoid future wars by creating an international organization to try and settle differences through mediation and arbitration, just talking about it, rather than actually fighting about those different problems. And so the 14 points had three main themes. The first five, which you see on your screen right there, are going to focus on international rules to eliminate future wars. Things such as you can see number 2 there says freedom of the seas in peace and war. Remember, it was the sinking of U.S. ships, their interference with our trade, and things like the sinking of the Lusitania that had brought us into the war in the first place. In addition to this, points 6 through 13 are going to be all about dividing empires, such as the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, and allowing what we call self-determination. That's just letting the people of those countries decide for themselves what they're going to be doing. So he thinks that new nations should have borders drawn with consideration of ethnic and national identities. And he wanted new nations to be free to choose their own governments. And finally, and most importantly, point 14 is going to focus on creating what is called the League of Nations to settle future international problems by diplomacy rather than war. Now, all the world leaders that you see there are going to meet in Paris in 1919 at the Palace of Versailles, and eventually they create what's called the Treaty of Versailles. And Wilson, who you see pictured on the far right over there, is going to hope that his 14 points becomes the framework for the peace treaty. But these other three guys didn't share his vision of peace without victory. They wanted to punish Germany. Now, eventually, as part of this entire peace process, Wilson does compromise on many of his 14 points. And eventually, the Treaty of Versailles is agreed to on June 28, 1919. It does create, most importantly, the League of Nations, which is an assembly made up of 27 different nations at the time. And they agree to use diplomacy, not war, to settle future conflicts. And they agree to work together to stop future acts of aggression. However, even though all of the allies and the Central Powers signed the Treaty of Versailles, Wilson could not. And that's because of a quirk in our Constitution which says that the president can negotiate a treaty, but the Senate has to be the one to actually approve it and to join the League of Nations. The problem was, though, is that most senators didn't like this, right? Because to sign this meant to join the League of Nations. And this would be, for us, a kind of a repudiation, a violation of our promise to never get involved in European affairs. And eventually, we didn't. In 1920, Republican Warren Harding ran for president, promised a return to normalcy and rejection of the League of Nations. With his victory in 1920, the Senate votes against the Treaty of Versailles and membership in the League of Nations, and we never join. And in many ways, this helps to precipitate or cause some of the issues that we're going to see in the 1930s and the beginning of World War II. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. Just a few reminders. Make sure that you know the causes of what brings in the United States to World War I, as well as our contributions to the war. And finally, how the Treaty of Versailles and its failure are important parts of the war. Until next time, as always, have a great day.